Lieutenant Colonel John Frost boarded a transport aircraft on the morning of the 17th of September, 1944, with his shotgun and his golf clubs packed in the hold. He expected to be home by the weekend. The operation had been planned in 7 days. The man who had designed it knew that 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting in the woods outside his objective, had been told this personally by Eisenhower's own chief of staff 2 days before the drop, and had dismissed the information. The man who would organize the German response was eating lunch in a hotel 1 mile from the British landing zones when the paratroopers fell out of the sky. What you are about to discover is not simply why Operation Market Garden failed. It is who knew it would fail, what they did with that knowledge, and what it cost, not just the 10,000 men who jumped, but an entire civilian population that the military history of this operation has largely forgotten. What do you think would have happened if Market Garden had succeeded? Tell me in the comments. Stay with this. The world that produced this operation was built from a sequence of decisions, and the first of them was not made in a planning room. It was made in an argument between 2 generals who could not stand each other, and it was made in August of 1944, when the war appeared to be almost over. It was not almost over. In the last week of August 1944, the German army in the West appeared to be disintegrating. The Allied breakout from Normandy had become a pursuit. France was being liberated at a pace that outran the maps. Belgium fell. Brussels was taken on the 3rd of September. Antwerp, with its enormous port facilities, 75 kilometers of intact docks, and the infrastructure that could have supplied every Allied soldier on the continent, was captured on the 4th of September. The German forces that had held Western Europe for 4 years were retreating in disorder, and in the headquarters of Allied High Command, the phrase being spoken was that the war might end by Christmas. The supply lines told a different story. The Allied armies had advanced so rapidly from the Normandy beaches that their logistics could not keep pace. The trucks and railways and depots that moved fuel and ammunition and food from the ports to the front were stretched to breaking. Multiple army groups could not all advance simultaneously. There was not enough of anything, and particularly not enough fuel, to sustain the entire Allied line in motion at once. On the 1st of September, General Dwight Eisenhower formally took command of all Allied ground forces. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who had held that command through the Normandy campaign, resented this change with an intensity he made no effort to conceal. He had written of Eisenhower that his ignorance of how to run the war was absolute and complete. He did not stop believing this when Eisenhower became his superior. What he did was begin arguing with increasing vehemence for a strategy that would put him effectively back in operational control of the decisive axis of advance. Montgomery's argument was for what he called a narrow front. Rather than advancing across the entire theater, concentrate everything on a single thrust northward, through the Netherlands, across the Rhine, into Germany's industrial heartland in the Ruhr. One hammer blow rather than distributed pressure. The thrust, Montgomery was quite clear, should be his, under his command, with all available resources directed to support it. Eisenhower rejected this more than once. The Americans had their own momentum, their own commanders who saw no reason to subordinate their armies to a British general's strategic vision. General George Patton's Third Army was driving east and wanted the resources for its own advance. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group was not inclined to halt while Montgomery struck north. The political mathematics of coalition command worked against everything Montgomery was proposing. There was also a problem that had nothing to do with personality or politics. The 1st Allied Airborne Army had been prepared for operation after operation, each of which had been canceled before execution. 16 planned operations had been stood down, one after another, as the ground forces overran the intended drop zones before the aircraft could launch. There was institutional pressure, from Washington and from within the Airborne Command, to use this force before the war ended without it. On the 10th of September, Eisenhower gave Montgomery a green light. Not for the narrow front, but for a single operation that Montgomery had proposed as a preliminary to something grander, an airborne assault into Holland, seizing the bridges over the rivers that stood between the Allied front line and the Rhine. If it worked, Montgomery would have his crossing. He would have the argument. 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 He would have his bridgehead. He would have the argument he needed to push for the rest of what he wanted. The operation was codenamed Market Garden. The planning window was 7 days to plan the largest airborne operation in history. The man who would command the most difficult part of that operation was not the kind of man inclined to complain about time constraints. He had been fighting since 1941, and what he had done in those years had made him, by September of 1944, the most experienced battalion commander in the 1st British Airborne Division. John Dutton Frost was born on the 31st of December, 1912, in Poona, British India, the son of a British Army officer, commissioned from Sandhurst in September of 1932. Served with the Iraq levies as a captain. Joined the newly formed parachute regiment in 1941, among the first to do so. In February of 1942, leading C Company on the Bruneval raid, he landed on a cliff above the English Channel in darkness, attacked a German radar installation, and used a copper hunting horn to gather his scattered men for the withdrawal to the beach. He blew the same horn in Tunisia in 1943, when his battalion was cut off 50 miles behind enemy lines after an armored column that was supposed to meet them never arrived. He lost 16 officers and 250 men fighting back through. Distinguished Service Order. He blew the horn again in Sicily, where the brigade was scattered by the drop, and the bridge they were assigned was briefly lost and then retaken. By the time he boarded his transport aircraft on the morning of the 17th of September, 1944, he was 31 years old, and he had been in more bad situations than most soldiers encounter in a full career. He had his Batman pack his golf clubs and his shotgun because he expected the operation to be finished in 2 days. 48 hours at the Arnhem Bridge, holding against whatever the Germans could assemble, until the ground forces of XXX Corps arrived. He is the most important person in this story. He is not the most powerful person in it. Roy Urquhart, born the 28th of November, 1901, commanded the 1st British Airborne Division. He had not commanded airborne troops before his appointment to that role in January of 1944. He was a capable infantry officer, given a formation he had never led in training or in combat. He expressed serious doubts about Market Garden 2 days before the drop, reportedly calling it a suicide operation, and then led it anyway, because that is what soldiers do with orders. His decision on the first day of the battle, to leave his headquarters and go forward personally to find his missing reconnaissance commander, would contribute directly to the disaster that followed. He acknowledged this afterward. Frederick Browning, known to everyone as Boy Browning, commanded the 1st Airborne Corps and had never commanded airborne troops in combat either. The American General James Gavin, commanding the 82nd Airborne, wrote privately in his diary that Browning unquestionably lacked the standing, influence, and judgment that came from proper troop experience, that his staff was superficial, and that this explained why British units fumbled along. Browning had 38 glider combinations allocated to bring his Corps headquarters into Holland. Each combination could have carried anti-tank guns, ammunition, and fighting men instead. He used them for his headquarters. It would not be the last decision Browning made that cost other people's lives. On the other side of the operation, in a hotel called De Tafelberg, in the Dutch village of Oosterbeek, Field Marshal Walter Model was eating lunch on the afternoon the operation began. Model was 53 years old, born on the 24th of January, 1891, in Saxony. His nicknames among the staff who worked under him included Frontline Pig, which was not affectionate. He was abusive, foul-mouthed, and given to reprimanding officers publicly. His own corps had asked to be transferred when he took command of it in 1941. Hitler called him his best field marshal and the savior of the Eastern Front, which gives some measure of what Hitler valued in a general. In the summer of 1944, Hitler had sent him west to stop the Allied advance through France after the Normandy breakout. He had established his Army Group B headquarters at Oosterbeek in mid-September, 100 kilometers behind the front, because the pace of the German retreat had briefly slowed enough to permit a proper command structure. His staff were pleased with the peaceful Dutch village. They thought they might stay for a while. 1 mile from Model's hotel, in the heathland and woodland that would become the British drop zones, nothing in the landscape announced what was about to happen. 11 kilometers east of the village, in the woods outside Arnhem, elements of the 9th SS Panzer Division and the 10th SS Panzer Division, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps under General Wilhelm Bittrich, were refitting after the destruction they had absorbed in Normandy. Both divisions were at less than half strength. The 9th SS had 2 operational Panther tanks. The 10th SS had between 5 and 14 operational Panzer IVs. They were battered, short-handed, and rebuilding in a location that the plan for Market Garden required to be empty. It was not unknown to Allied command that they were there. That is the point from which everything else follows. The operation rested on 3 simultaneous requirements. The American 101st Airborne Division, under Major General Maxwell Taylor, would take the crossings around Eindhoven. The American 82nd Airborne, under Brigadier General James Gavin, would take the crossings at Nijmegen and the strategically vital Groesbeek Heights to the east. The British 1st Airborne Division, with the 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade attached, would take the most distant objective, the road bridge over the Lower Rhine at Arnhem, 62 miles from the Allied start line. Those divisions would hold their objectives until relieved. Then X Corps, 20,000 vehicles behind the Guards Armored Division, would cover 65 miles in 48 hours up a single road, linking each division to the next, ending at Arnhem, ending at the Rhine. Every element depended on every other element. There was no contingency for significant delay. The first decision that made the plan structurally unsound was the choice of drop zones. The RAF was concerned about anti-aircraft positions near the Arnhem Bridge. The solution was to land the division 8 to 10 miles west at Oosterbeek and Wolfheze, on open heathland suitable for gliders. Urquhart protested. He wanted his men closer to the objective. He got nowhere. The consequence was that 9,000 lightly armed paratroopers would have to march through 8 miles of occupied city while the Germans organized a response. Surprise, the one advantage an airborne operation must have, or it has nothing, was surrendered before the aircraft took off. The second decision was the 3-day lift. There were not enough transport aircraft to deliver all the airborne troops in a single flight. The division would arrive in 3 waves over 3 consecutive days. Urquhart would land with only a portion of his force on day 1. Part of his strength would be committed to guarding empty fields for the incoming second lift, while the rest tried to reach a bridge 8 miles away. The third decision was the radios. The standard British airborne radio operated at a reliable range of 3 to 5 miles in open conditions. No one had time to test the sets in the wooded, built-up terrain around Arnhem before the operation launched. The communications failure that followed was not an accident of war. It was a predictable consequence of a known technical limitation applied to conditions no one had assessed. One further detail belongs here, from a source that predates the operation by several years. In the British Army Staff College course before the war, candidates had been presented with a tactical problem: how to approach Arnhem from the direction of Nijmegen. The correct answer was to leave the main road after 1 to 2 miles, cross the Rhine to the west, and attack in a flanking movement. Candidates who drove straight up the road failed. The correct approach was in the institutional record. The operation drove straight up the road. The plan rested on a final assumption that overrode every technical objection: that the German forces in the Netherlands were too disorganized and too demoralized to resist effectively. Whatever was in those woods outside Arnhem was probably irrelevant. The intelligence said otherwise. The government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park monitored and decoded German radio traffic through a program known as Ultra, a capability that had provided Allied commanders with an unprecedented ability to read German operational communications throughout the war. In September of 1944, Ultra intercepts confirmed the movement of the 9th SS and 10th SS Panzer divisions to the area north and east of Arnhem. The intercepts reached Army headquarters level. They were not passed to the paratroopers who would be landing among those divisions. Eisenhower was sufficiently alarmed to send his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, personally to Montgomery's headquarters on the 15th of September, 2 days before the drop, to press for modifications to the plan. Smith suggested landing additional troops at Arnhem to offset the armored threat. Montgomery dismissed him. The concerns were set aside. The operation proceeded unchanged. In the intelligence section of the 1st Airborne Corps, Major Brian Urquhart, not the general, a different man with the same surname, was conducting his own analysis. He received confirmation from Dutch resistance contacts that SS armor was near the landing zones. He requested aerial reconnaissance. On the 12th of September, a Spitfire 11 from No. 16 Squadron photographed armored vehicles in the Arnhem area. Major Urquhart presented these photographs to General Browning and argued that the 1st Airborne was about to land in a concentration of armor it could not resist. Browning examined the photographs and described the tanks as probably unserviceable, manned by young boys and old men, not first-line troops. Major Urquhart was relieved of his command. A rumor circulated that he had suffered a nervous breakdown. He had not suffered a nervous breakdown. He had done his job. Montgomery, writing in his memoirs years after the war, acknowledged what the intelligence had established. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps was refitting in the Arnhem area, having limped there. But they were wrong, he wrote, in supposing it could not fight effectively. Its battle state was far beyond their expectation. Ultra was declassified in 1974. It confirmed that senior Allied commanders had known the divisions were there. The knowledge was in the system. The decision was made anyway. The reason was not ignorance. Montgomery believed Market Garden was his last opportunity to pursue the narrow front strategy, to end the war on his terms. An operation he needed to proceed could not be stopped by evidence that suggested it should not. When institutional desire and contrary intelligence meet at that level of command, one of them is set aside. Major Brian Urquhart discovered which one. On the morning of the 17th of September, 1944, over 1,500 aircraft and nearly 500 gliders filled the sky above the English countryside and turned toward Holland. Witnesses on the ground described the armada as filling the horizon from end to end. It was the largest airborne operation ever launched. Model was at his table in the Hotel de Tafelberg. At 13:40 hours, a report reached his headquarters that enemy troops had landed nearby. His chief of staff said this would be the decisive battle of the war. Model replied, "Don't exaggerate like that. It's clear. Get to work." He was in his car within minutes. Within the hour, he was at Wilhelm Bittrich's SS Panzer Corps headquarters, directing the German response to an operation whose entire rationale depended on the Germans not being able to respond. Model made one decision in those first hours that the Allied planners had not anticipated. Bittrick recommended destroying the Arnhem Bridge, denying it to both sides. Model refused. "Keep it intact," he ordered. "Move the 10th SS south across it toward Nijmegen." The bridge that Frost was racing to capture was preserved by a German field marshal's tactical calculation. The opportunity Frost was about to seize existed because the man trying to kill him left it open. The British drop went largely as planned. The paratroopers fell onto the heathland at Oosterbeek and Wolfheze in the early afternoon sunshine and landed mostly without opposition. Dutch civilians poured into the streets to welcome them, assuming they had been delivered from occupation. This was genuine, and it was dangerous because thousands of men trying to move through streets blocked by cheering crowds are not moving toward their objective. The first hours had a plan within the plan, a coup de main. The 1st Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron, jeeps, fast and well armed, would race to the Arnhem Bridge immediately after landing and seize it before the Germans could organize. The reconnaissance squadron landed successfully. It then took 2 hours to assemble on the landing zone. In those 2 hours, Sturmbannführer Sepp Kraft, commanding a nearby SS depot and NCO training battalion, moved his men into blocking positions on the approach roads between the drop zones and Arnhem. Kraft had no armor. He had no prepared positions. He had initiative and the time it took the reconnaissance squadron to form up. His blocking line was in place when the jeeps finally moved. The coup de main was stopped before it reached the city. 3 parachute battalions set off along designated routes toward the bridge. The 1st and 3rd battalions, on the northern routes, ran into Kraft's men almost immediately. They were halted, engaged, pinned down. The battalions that were supposed to reinforce Frost at the bridge never got through. They would spend the following days trying to fight toward him through German blocking positions that grew stronger by the hour as Model directed reinforcements from the east. Frost took the southernmost route, a secondary road close to the Rhine. It ran through less contested ground. When his companies became separated in the failing light, he blew his copper hunting horn, and they found each other again in the dark. By 8:00 in the evening of the 17th of September, the 2nd Battalion had reached the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge. There were approximately 745 men with him. The plan required 9,000. The southern end of the bridge was held by the Germans. The railway bridge at Oosterbeek had been blown as his leading men tried to cross it. The pontoon bridge had been sailed to the south bank before the parachutists arrived. The road bridge was the only crossing remaining. Frost's men moved into the houses along the northern ramp, set up firing positions in the upper floors, dug in among the ground floor rooms, and prepared to hold what they had taken. "We were content," Frost wrote afterward. After what seemed like several hours, but was in reality no more than 2, the battle died away. We were feeling very pleased with ourselves. We were rather hoping that we would have the honor of welcoming the army into Arnhem all to ourselves. Urquhart was not at his headquarters that evening. A false message had reached him reporting that the reconnaissance squadron's jeeps had been destroyed in the landing. Concerned that the coup de main had failed before it could begin, he had gone forward in his own jeep to find the squadron's commander and redirect the plan. He became separated from his staff, ended the first day trapped in a house on the outskirts of Arnhem, and was effectively absent from command for nearly 24 hours. The largest British airborne operation of the war unfolded without its divisional commander. The radios were failing. Units that needed to talk to each other could not. Urquhart's headquarters could not reach Frost at the bridge. Frost could not reach the battalions trying to fight through to him. At the end of its first day, the division was blind and silent. What Frost did not know until the following morning, when his men tapped into the civilian Dutch telephone network, using a public exchange in an occupied city to contact their own division, was that XXX Corps had not yet crossed its start line. The ground component of Market Garden began its advance at 1400 hours on the 17th of September, 2.5 hours after the airborne landings, already behind schedule. The highway running north through Holland was elevated above the surrounding polders, flat marshy ground where armor could not maneuver, giving German anti-tank guns on the flanks a clean line of fire at every vehicle in the column. 9 tanks were destroyed in the first hour. The road could accommodate 2 vehicles abreast. It could not accommodate flanking movements. Every delay compounded the next. Eindhoven was not reached until the evening of the 18th of September, nearly 18 hours behind schedule. At Son, north of the city, the Germans had blown the bridge before the 101st Airborne could capture it. Engineers worked through the night to construct a Bailey Bridge. The road between Eindhoven and Nijmegen was cut repeatedly by German forces that appeared from the flanks, fought, were driven off, and appeared again further north. The route the soldiers named Hell's Highway was never secure for more than a few hours at any point along its length. At Nijmegen, the situation was more complicated than the plan had assumed. Gavin's 82nd Airborne had been directed to prioritize the Groesbeek Heights over the Nijmegen Bridge on the first day, based in part on an intelligence report, incorrect, that as many as 1,000 German tanks were hidden in the forests to the east. The result was that the Nijmegen Bridge, the crossing without which XXX Corps could not reach Arnhem, was not attacked in force on the 17th. It was attacked on the 18th. It held. On the 20th of September, the bridge was finally captured, at a cost that statistics alone cannot convey. Men of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne crossed the river wall in canvas assault boats, 2 kilometers downstream of the bridge, in full daylight, under direct German fire from the northern bank. The boats had no armor. The current was strong. Approximately half the boats in the first wave reached the far bank. The men who landed attacked immediately, moving along the riverbank toward the bridge, while XXX Corps attacked the southern end simultaneously. The crossing cost approximately 200 casualties. The bridge was taken from both ends at once. 8 miles separated XXX Corps from Arnhem. 6 hours of September the 20th remained. The Corps did not advance. The reasons recorded: exhaustion, the elevated road north of Nijmegen, German guns on the polders to either side, are in the various accounts. What is equally in the record is the arithmetic: 8 miles, 6 hours, and Frost's men had been holding the bridge for 3 days. He did not withdraw. His orders were to hold, and beyond the orders was a calculation. As long as his battalion occupied the northern ramp, the German armor concentrated north of the Rhine could not cross south to reinforce the defenses against XXX Corps. He was not simply holding a bridge. He was blocking the only southern crossing available to the armored forces that would otherwise have reached Nijmegen. Military analysis after the war confirmed it. Without Frost's hold at the northern ramp, the 82nd Airborne and the 2nd British Army at Nijmegen would have had little or no chance of capturing their bridge intact. He was right. It cost everything he had. The battle at the northern ramp had been continuous since the evening of the 17th. On the morning of the 18th, The 9th SS Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion attempted to cross from the German-held end and retake the northern approaches. They came in armored vehicles, moving fast. Frost's men fired from the surrounding houses. The engagement was intense and brief. Scores of German vehicles were destroyed on the bridge ramp. The battalion commander was killed. The attack was broken. Frost then ordered his men to stop sniping at the retreating vehicles. They were almost out of ammunition, and every round spent now was a round not available for what was coming. The supply drops arrived on schedule. Allied aircraft came overhead on the second and third days, carrying the food, ammunition, and medical supplies the division needed to survive. The aircraft held their approach runs with discipline. The supplies fell to earth on the designated drop zones. The designated drop zones had been overrun by German forces on the first day. Soldiers on the ground lit signal fires, waved recognition panels, deployed colored smoke. The aircraft maintained their courses and dropped to the coordinates in their orders. The Germans collected the supplies. The buildings around Frost's position were burning one by one. The German method was systematic. Artillery and tank fire directed at each occupied house in turn, compressing the British perimeter toward the bridge ramp. On the third day, German officers approached under a white flag and proposed a ceasefire to remove the wounded. Frost agreed. 250 wounded were carried out. The SS officers who arranged the truce were, by multiple accounts, respectful, telling Frost's men they had fought well. The ceasefire ended, and the bombardment resumed. On the morning of the 20th of September, Frost was hit in both legs by mortar fragments. He was taken to the cellar and continued to direct the battle from a stretcher. The perimeter by this point held approximately 100 paratroopers capable of fighting. The others were dead or wounded. The buildings were going one by one. The brigade headquarters building, the one with the deepest cellar, the one in which nearly 300 of the most seriously wounded had been concentrated, was set alight by German incendiaries. The fire could not be extinguished. The wounded could not be moved under fire. They would burn. Frost ordered the surrender. Before the Germans entered, he removed the insignia from his uniform, hoping not to be identified as the commanding officer. The Germans found him anyway. As the SS men helped carry out the casualties, one told Frost's men that no living enemy had beaten them. The paratroopers could not dispute it. They had not been beaten. They had been abandoned, run out of ammunition, and burned out of their positions. The bridge had been held for 3 days and 4 nights by one battalion. Military analysis after the war concluded that even the entire 1st Airborne Division at full strength could not have been expected to hold it much longer. Frost's last exchange before the Germans entered is in his memoir. To his second in command, he said, "Well, Doug, I am afraid we have not got away with it this time." The reply, "No, sir, but we gave them a damn good run for their money." We still could not believe, Frost wrote, that XXX Corps would fail to come to our rescue. 3 miles west, the survivors of the 1st British Airborne Division had been contracting for days into a shrinking perimeter around the Hartenstein Hotel in Oosterbeek. The hotel had changed hands once already in this battle. Until the 14th of September, 3 days before the operation began, it had served as the staff headquarters for Model's Army Group B. His furniture was still in the rooms when Urquhart's men arrived. The general set up his divisional headquarters in the building that the man trying to destroy his division had recently vacated. German attacks pressed the perimeter from north, west, and east simultaneously. the artillery fire was continuous. On the 23rd of September, Sergeant Dennis Smith of the Army Film and Photographic Unit wrote in his diary, "We have had a very heavy shelling this morning, and now the situation is serious. The men are tired, weary, and food is becoming scarce. And to make matters worse, we are having heavy rain. If we are not relieved soon, the men will just drop from sheer exhaustion." The supply aircraft continued to arrive overhead and continued to drop to the wrong coordinates. Supplies fell in full view of both sides outside the British lines. The correct drop zones had been held on day one, had been overrun, and no working mechanism existed to redirect the aircraft to where the men actually were. On the 21st of September, the 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade finally arrived. Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski brought approximately 750 surviving Poles to ground at Driel, south of the Rhine. He could see the British perimeter across the water. He could not reach it. That night, 55 Poles crossed in boats. 35 made it into the perimeter. They were welcomed by men who could no longer be saved by the numbers that had arrived. Private Ernest Archer swam the river in darkness with a message because no radio could bridge the distance. He reached the far bank. The message got through. A boat crossing was arranged with rubber craft and a guide cable. The cable broke against the current. The oars were insufficient for the fast-flowing water. 55 Poles crossed before dawn. The others could not. 3 amphibious vehicles loaded with supplies made the crossing, but were carried 1,000 yards downstream of the perimeter and buried in the mud, delivering their loads to the Germans. On the night of the 24th and 25th of September, the evacuation codenamed Operation Berlin, engineers guided survivors to the Rhine bank in darkness, using white tape torn from field dressings tied to trees. Silence was enforced. No boots on gravel. 2,100 crossed. 7,500 were either dead or remained behind as prisoners of war. The war correspondent Alan Wood, who had been at Oosterbeek, wrote afterward, "If in the years to come you meet a man who says I was at Arnhem, raise your hat and buy him a drink." He wrote it as tribute. It was also an accounting, and the full accounting was longer than the tribute. American casualties in the operation: 3,996 dead, wounded, or missing. British and Polish losses: 11,000 to 13,000 dead or wounded, and 6,450 captured. German casualties: 7,500 to 10,000. The 1st British Airborne Division suffered 80% casualties. It never fought again as a formation. The Rhine crossing and the advance on the Ruhr were delayed 6 months. The Allies resumed the broad front strategy. The war ended not by Christmas 1944, but in May of 1945. Montgomery, informed of the outcome, said the operation had been 90% successful. He had captured 90% of the corridor. Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, who heard this, was reported to have replied, "My country cannot afford another success from Montgomery." The prince understood something the military ledger does not contain. On the 17th of September, 1944, 30,000 Dutch railway workers went on strike. They struck at the request of the Dutch government in exile, in solidarity with Market Garden, believing the liberation of their country was imminent. The train stopped and did not run again until the war ended. In response, the German occupation authorities imposed an embargo on food transport to the western provinces of the Netherlands. Before the embargo, Dutch civilians in the occupied West received approximately 1,600 calories per day. By mid-November of 1944, the daily ration had fallen to 1,000 calories. By January of 1945, it was 500. By spring, people in Amsterdam and Rotterdam and The Hague were eating tulip bulbs, sugar beets, and grass. They burned their furniture for heat. Funeral homes could not process the dead quickly enough, and bodies were stored in churches while families waited. The Dutch call this the Hongerwinter, the Hunger Winter. It killed approximately 22,000 people. 4.5 million were affected. Its connection to the failure of Market Garden is direct, documented, and established. It appears infrequently in British accounts of the battle. Children born to women who were pregnant during the famine showed elevated rates of obesity, diabetes, schizophrenia, and cardiovascular disease that persisted across their entire lives. The failure of a 9-day military operation in September of 1944 produced measurable harm in bodies that were not yet born when the paratroopers fell from the sky. Montgomery's 90%. Montgomery remained, as he put it in his memoirs, Market Garden's unrepentant advocate. The operation had been properly planned and improperly supported. If it had been properly backed from the beginning, it would have succeeded despite his mistakes. He acknowledged, in the same memoirs, that the 2nd SS Panzer Corps had been refitting near Arnhem, and that its battle state had been far beyond their expectation. He did not draw the connection between those two sentences. He did not identify himself as the person who had been told about the SS Panzer Corps, specifically and in person, 2 days before the drop, and had proceeded anyway. Browning's post-operational report allocated responsibility broadly. He cited the slowness of XXX Corps, the weather, his communications staff, and insufficient RAF close air support. He then succeeded in having Sosabowski dismissed from command of the Polish brigade for what the report characterized as an increasingly hostile attitude. Sosabowski had been watching his men dropped into a catastrophe they had not created, and he had said so to people who had the authority to act on this information and did not. The Poles were formally rehabilitated in 2006. Sosabowski had been dead since 1967. Eisenhower's post-war statement was direct. I not only approved Market Garden, I insisted upon it. He accepted shared responsibility. It was one of several ways in which he and Montgomery were not alike. Major Brian Urquhart, the intelligence officer, lived until 2013. He was 93 years old. He had not had a nervous breakdown. He had presented photographs of German armor to his commanding general, been told the tanks were probably unserviceable and manned by young boys and old men, and been removed from his post. In the complete accounting of Market Garden, he was the man who had been most fully correct and most completely ignored. The documents that vindicate him have been available since Ultra was declassified in 1974. Frost died on the 21st of May, 1993, at 80 years of age. Model died on the 21st of April, 1945, encircled in the Ruhr pocket, having refused to surrender his command. He burned his personal papers before he shot himself. Relatively little of his inner life is known. Browning died on the 14th of March, 1974. Montgomery died on the 24th of March, 1976, still Market Garden's unrepentant advocate. Every September since the war ended, Dutch civilians and veterans have gathered at Arnhem and Oosterbeek. They lay flowers at the airborne cemetery at Oosterbeek, where 1,755 men are buried. The Dutch remember both things the operation produced: the battle and the winter that followed. In British accounts of Market Garden, those tend to appear in separate chapters. Market Garden is taught at military staff colleges as a compounding failure. Intelligence dismissed at the highest level. Planning time insufficient for the operation's complexity. Drop zones chosen for logistical rather than tactical reasons. Communications not tested against the terrain. A single road assumed adequate for 20,000 vehicles. The entire plan predicated on a German collapse that the evidence available at the time did not support. Every one of those failures was identifiable before the operation launched. Several were identified by the people whose job it was to identify them and set aside. The lesson taught is not how intelligence fails. It is how command refuses intelligence when command has already decided what it wants to do. The bridge at Arnhem was renamed the John Frost Bridge in 1978, reportedly against Frost's wishes. He accepted the honor with reluctance. Commuters cross it every day. Most do not know the name of the man it honors, or what 745 men held at its northern ramp for 3 days and 4 nights in September of 1944. Frost's Batman had packed the shotgun and the golf clubs on the morning the operation began. They stayed in the hold. He was liberated in March of 1945 by soldiers of the American Third Army, who recognized him by the red beret he was still wearing after 6 months in German captivity. The copper hunting horn, the one he had blown at Bruneval in February of 1942, at Oudna in Tunisia, at Arnhem on the evening of the 17th of September, as his companies found each other in the dark before they reached the bridge, was taken from him when the Germans made him a prisoner of war on the 20th of September, 1944. It has not been recovered. What do you think would have happened if Market Garden had succeeded? Tell me in the comments.